Chapter 531, Rune Visualization. The world spun around Silas, and he found himself on yet another long, foggy path accented by doors. This time, there were 10 of them instead of 9. But the location felt pretty identical to the first secret realm he had entered. Rune Sight. Rune Visualization. The first secret realm, Introduction to Rune, Rune Patterns, and Rune Geometry, was related to Rune Sight. It taught him the fundamentals of runes and how to interact with them before describing the concept of strokes and foundations to him. He memorized a great deal of strokes and their culminating foundations from that realm before he handed it to his sister. Now it seemed that it was time for him to finally improve. Silas entered the first door, but it was only a few seconds before it vanished, and he appeared on the road again. He stood in silence for a moment, his eyes closed. The Rune Sight secret realm was all about getting him familiar with runes. It was titled appropriately. Those with Rune Sight could see and interact with runes, but it wasn't on an exceptionally deep level. By comparison, those with Rune Visualization could begin to feel runes. They didn't just interact with them through a single sense but rather through multiple. Upon seeing a rune, it was possible to formulate this rune in one's mind and imprint it into memory, understanding it implicitly in exchange for a good amount of study. However, Silas had long reached this level. When he stamped his runes into the air to pass the first door of the Rune Sight secret realm, he was already using an advanced application of rune visualization. Most with rune visualization were only able to etch runes in part. Only those nearing rune enlightenment could do as he had done. But even then, it wouldn't be nearly so quick. So this secret realm is a game of memory. Easy enough. He took a step forward and vanished into the second door. When he appeared inside, he found a more complex formulation of what had been in the first door. There was a quick flash of a few strokes, and he was meant to recall them. It was too easy. When he got to the fourth door, the test changed a bit. The strokes came faster, but then at the end, he was presented with 3 foundations. He was meant to recall the strokes he had seen earlier and point out the foundation they formed. The ancient cursive that formed the foundations was incredibly similar. A layman might not even realize that there were 3 different foundations before them in the first place, and they might even assume they were looking at 3 identical images. Silas only gave them a glance before picking one. The room was cleared, and he moved on to the 5th door, then the 6th. When he got to the 7th, it was no longer strokes flying at him. Instead, it was foundations. Remembering a flood of foundations was obviously many times more difficult, but as Nosfaline had said, with Rune Soul, Silas was capable of grasping a rune with his 6th sense. In an instant, he could get a full 3D rendering of the rune in his mind in its full form. Even with his dinged wisdom, he sliced through the challenge, not struggling at all. At the end of the 9th door, the foundations fused into true runes that looked nearly identical to one another. But the runes themselves were hardly made up of 10 foundations when Silas was used to working with 50 foundation runes by now. Considering runes became exponentially more difficult to manage every 10 foundations, it was hard to even fathom how much more difficult dealing with his slow and freeze ice poison runes were over this. He cleared the 9th door with lightning-like efficiency, his eyes darting around with an ease that belied their speed. He stepped out and moved to the 10th and final door. When he entered, there was a flash in his eyes, and an enormous rune appeared before him. Silas was a bit surprised. That was because he saw that this rune was easily tens of times more complicated than any rune he had come up against previously. He was starting to feel a bit disappointed in this secret realm. At least the Rune Sight secret realm had taught him something new, but he honestly hadn't learned much this time around. Well, other than some useful configurations for strokes. Silas raised his hand, about to clear the door. After the novelty wore off, he realized that it was not very complicated at all. All he had to do was replicate this rune with his rune visualization, and it would be considered a pass. However, he paused after a moment, giving the rune another long glance. Rune visualization. Is it really true that it isn't trying to teach me anything? He thought back to the previous doors and how they progressed. Namely, he thought about the choosing challenges where he would get a choice of 3 foundations or runes he had to choose from depending on the strokes or foundations he had interacted with earlier. When he came to this point in his thoughts, he had a flash of realization. Those foundations and runes were nearly identical, they only had small differences between them. I thought that that was the challenge and just picked the one that perfectly matched the previous strokes and foundations. But, what if therein lay the secret? Silas realized at that moment that the runes and foundations during those choosing challenges weren't just somewhat identical, for all intents and purposes, they were identical. If he used his rune soul to form any one of them, they would all perform the same exact function. So what was the difference between them? The obvious answer was that the small quirks were identical to the strokes and foundations that preceded them. But staring at this, complex, rune before him, Silas realized something else. He had almost missed something profound. This secret realm wasn't just teaching him how to visualize and memorize strokes, foundations, and runes. It was also teaching him the most efficient configurations of them. On the one hand, it was a memorization exercise, but by the same token, the methods you could use to remember runes with greater ease were the same methods you could use to draw them with greater ease, the same methods you could rely on to expend less wisdom and ether per rune, and most importantly, the same methods you could use to construct them the fastest. Silas' gaze flashed, and his intention moved. With a glance, he memorized the large, complex rune, and in the next instant, an identical one was formed right over it, shattering the original to pieces and replacing it with a far more perfect form. Not only had he cleared the 10th door, he had improved upon its design, creating something unprecedented for someone with rune visualization. You have pleased the system. Silas looked at this message and shook his head. Last time he received a system reward, but it seemed that he wouldn't be so lucky this time around. The demerits hanging over his head were too heavy. Chapter 532, Rune Enlightenment. Despite his feelings, Silas felt that he had grown a great deal after exiting the secret realm. If he applied the rules of rune construction, then he would be able to draw runes twice as fast with half the effort. In addition, the struggles he had with dealing with higher stroke and foundation runes would be greatly diminished. Before, it took him a great deal of time and effort to master his slow and freeze runes, and they both only had 50 or so foundations. But according to Nosfaline, the limit of the F grade was 100 foundations. If you factored in the large leap in difficulty there was every 10 foundations, Silas had a hard time being confident in drawing a 60 foundation rune, even if he was given several days, let alone 70 and above. But what he never realized was that there were rules to putting runes together, almost like nomenclature for molecular formulas and atoms. There was an order to how things were supposed to go together. A single rune might have dozens of, technically, accurate ways to put it together, but only one most efficient way. Silas had missed this because he skipped steps in his rune mastery. He went right from constructing runes slowly to stamping them out in whole. But because of that, he forgot the importance of individual strokes and foundations along the way. There were certain strokes that worked best when incorporated first and certain foundations that were more like cherries on top, as opposed to the root of a rune. These rules would change depending on the rune in question. For example, his ice poison rune had a foundation that he had named something akin to sovereignty in the past. He had named it as such because this foundation was very overbearing and it was responsible for suppressing and oppressing other forms of ether it came across, making it difficult for an opponent to expel the poison from their bodies. This was a core and foundational foundation of the ice poison rune on the surface. But in reality, it was actually secondary in character. It was more important to draw the ice and poison characteristics first. In the case of the slow ice poison rune, the poison foundations were more important. In the case of the freeze ice poison rune, the ice foundations were more important. Every rune had to be approached in this way, and only by finding the most efficient configurations would you find the easiest method of drawing them. Silas held out a hand and stamped it down. A freeze ice poison rune took shape in the blink of an eye. Despite the fact that ice ether wasn't prevalent in this dry and harsh climate, he hadn't even needed to use his less than woodland frost domain greater than. The strain wasn't great at all, and he didn't rely on his woodland warlord title to accomplish it either. If he continued to draw runes like this, his combat efficiency would reach an unconscious level. Skills would be like play putty in his hands. After this, he would need to see if he could take the evolved mana path wand for a spin again to see if he could incorporate the wood element into it. But first, he wanted to enter the Rune Enlightenment secret realm. It hadn't even taken him 10 minutes to clear the rune visualization secret realm. He had more than enough time, and he was eager to see what he might gain this time. His interaction with the Clipsians at the Great Celestial Wall taught him that there was far more to rune mastery than just elevating it to higher realms. If his foundation was even half as good as that Clipsian woman Elindor, he would have shattered the protections in the first instant. This time, it took Silas half an hour to clear the secret realm. When he stepped out, his eyes were glowing with a bright light as though they were still analyzing and thinking through something. Rune enlightenment was all about making runes intuitive. Even if you hadn't studied a rune before, just observing one for a moment would allow you to have a general idea of its function and a guess as to how you might piece a similar one together. This was the final layer of foundation for the coming rune breath realm, which gave runes life. Well, this wasn't exactly the right way to describe it. Rather than giving runes life, it was more like rune breath allowed a rune master to sense the life of a rune and communicate with it, making controlling, forming, and guiding them much easier. This subtle difference was its own enlightenment to Silas because he realized something else. The burden of forming a rune didn't have to be on his shoulders entirely. Strokes were the fundamental laws of the world, and foundations were the natural and simplest configurations they could enter in order to communicate something about said laws. Runes themselves would take effort to forge because they were more complex. The world tended toward chaos, but runes were the epitome of order. A lot of work had to be done to form them. However, if you could offload the effort of forming strokes and foundations to the world and only had to worry about bringing them together to form runes after the fact, wouldn't forging runes become even easier? If before Silas could form runes twice as fast, it was easily 10 times as fast now. This wasn't just because of rune enlightenment, but because he had a natural comprehension of how to incorporate rune breath into what he grasped as well. This time, when he pressed a palm to the air, there was a rush of ice that surged around him. In an instant, dozens of freeze ice poison runes took shape, and the entire room became a world of ice and cancerous blue runes. Silas exhaled a breath that frosted the air, minor particles of wood in the air. Just as he was about to see what the rune breath secret realm had for him, a notification caught his attention. Chaosheir. Chapter 533, Cocky Bastard. Silas' lip couldn't help but curl a bit when he saw her. She looked like she wanted to take a bite out of someone's neck, half irritated and half anxious. It was only when he suddenly appeared at her table that she noticed his appearance. You. Chaosheir didn't know what to say. Silas looked perfectly healthy, as though he had been living the good life. Honestly, it could be said that he had been. He had had his first night of excellent rest in a while, he had eaten a mountain's worth of food, and he had people waiting on him everywhere he looked. In fact, because he knew that he was coming here, he was wearing the same outfit he had when he touched down from the helicopter to paradise, a turtleneck, a pair of jeans, and a nice trench coat on top. At the moment, he looked nothing like the man who was in the news everywhere. Nothing like the man who had murdered a general and his steed with nothing more than his fist. Nothing like the man that was now wanted for killing a general of the Celestial Republic. Nothing like the man who had a warrant out for his arrest. Nothing like the man who had somehow lost all his merits at once. This last one was the one that Chaosheir worried the most about. When she saw Silas' name disappear from the merit leaderboard, how could she think anything other than the fact he had died? But since he was here alive, that only meant one thing. Just how many demerits did he have right now? Chaosheir suddenly wanted to punch his smiling face. Didn't he know how dangerous this was? The Grimblade's warrant was the least of his worries. At least only Grimblades could partake in that. But having demerits, especially heavy demerits, was like being pegged as Earth's #1 enemy. If they weren't in a virtual setting right now, she might have gotten a quick-time event to kill Silas right here and now. It wasn't just the fact that the system would target Silas, but it might reward people for targeting him as well. He had gone from the hero of Earth to public enemy #1 of Earth. You seem worried, Silas finally broke the silence. Fuck, Silas, what did you get yourself into? The usual. Chaosheir rolled her eyes. She should have known better than to worry about this bastard. Only good people died early, and he was far from it. Still, seeing how casual he was being, she relaxed. Where have you been for 4 months? I got stuck in a dungeon outside of Earth. I thought it was only a day and a bit that passed. When I got back, it was 4 months. Chaosheir's gaze flickered. This was the first she had heard of such a thing, but she nodded, taking it in stride. What did you want to talk about? Silas almost laughed. This woman was a tough nut to crack, indeed. If he hadn't contacted her so soon, she would have thrown a fit. But now that he had, she sounded like she wanted to shoo him away already. How is Castlemaine? Chaosheir grinned. Didn't you notice? My little castle is back at the top. And the sylphs? Chaosheir frowned. That's trickier. What happened with Merchant Guatem? Merchant Guatem was the so-called memory merchant that Silas had coerced into helping out Chaosheir and the others. He was a tricky person to deal with as well. Silas could see that he had a great deal of ambition. It was hard to say if he had continued to be loyal after Silas had been gone for so long. He and Dad have actually hit it off. The two of them control about 20% of Gwiz City's economy. In fact, they control over 40% of the economies of the other two system cities as well. I've managed to reach a Countess Noble title. Chaosheir stopped talking as though she had just remembered something. You son of a bitch. How did I forget? Who told you that you could just unilaterally marry me? Did I agree? The smile in Silas' eyes deepened. Does it make much of a difference? What is that supposed to mean? Whether we marry now or in the future, it's all the same to me. Chaosheir was speechless. When had this guy become so completely and utterly shameless? No, he always had been. He always moved to the beat of his own drum. Unless he decided on something himself, it was practically impossible for any outside forces to change his thoughts and opinions. Realizing this, Chaosheir changed tactics. She leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over another. At the moment, she was wearing a full set of leather armor. There was no scant clothing to be seen, and in contrast to the elegance of Silas' dress, she seemed a bit out of place. However, her demeanor made it hard for anyone to call her out on such a thing. She seemed to be right at home regardless of the atmosphere. With the way she stretched back, the outline of her torso tugged against the leather, stretching it taut and revealing the outlines of her curves. Not that they were very well hidden to begin with. Even with everything perfectly covered, it was hard to hide such a proud chest and wide hips, especially not when she crossed her arms over her chest. Seeing Silas' not-so-shy gaze, her sneer only deepened. This man really had become a little pervert. You have a wife that you can't touch. Doesn't that fill you with frustration? Chaosheir asked in a teasing tone. Frustration? No, anticipation is more accurate, Silas replied casually. I don't remember saying I would give you a chance. You already have once, and you more than likely will again. You're a cocky bastard, you know that. Silas lifted his gaze from the outline of Chaosheir's body, and she felt her breathing hitch in her throat for a moment. There was something about the intensity of Silas' gaze that almost threw her over the edge. Then, he suddenly smiled. A real smile, not that half-cocked nonsense he usually pulled. I think you like that about me very much. Don't you? Chaosheir stared at him in a daze. Chapter 534, Bad Karma. The smile was almost blinding. Sometimes Chaosheir forgot how handsome Silas was, but that wasn't because his stoicism washed it away. It was rather because she had grown up with him, making it easy to forget. Ironically, it was something the both of them dealt with. Silas hadn't seemed to realize just the sort of bombshell Chaosheir was until recently, having practically erased his 17th birthday memory from his head. But looking at his smile now, it was hard for Chaosheir to ignore it. Even if she preferred when he was being aggressive and pushy. Silas didn't have what she might describe as movie star looks. If that was the case, she might cringe instead. She didn't favor men like that very much. That wasn't to say he lacked in the looks department. Instead, it was to say that he looked more like he should have a spot reserved in an old western town, sitting at a bar and rotating a glass of whiskey in his hand slowly. He had an aura to him that was almost smoky and smoldering, one accented by the sharpness of his green eyes in a way that any other color might not have been able to match. It's the fucking 5 o'clock shadow, Chaosheir mumbled absent-mindedly. Silas was always clean-shaven, but the summoning had made him fall off the wagon with his normal routines. It was no wonder she had noticed his looks more this time around. He didn't even look like the normal Silas. Just this slight change was enough to send her gushing. I can't make it too easy for this bastard. You know, you're speaking out loud. Shut up and let me, chaosheir replied without missing a beat and lacking the slightest bit of shame. After a while, chaosheir regained her bearings and shook her head. This really was a bit too embarrassing, but her libido and dripping in it aside, how attractive Silas was to her was quite low on her, take seriously, priority list right now. There were attractive men all across the world, and she was sure that at least a handful of them had a personality like Silas that was likewise to her liking. The matters of all those years ago weren't so easy for her to forget. And honestly, it really didn't seem like Silas had changed much at all since then. He had changed his mind not because he felt bad, and not because he had had a change of heart about his treatment of her, but purely because he decided he wanted her now. And honestly, that just wasn't good enough. She spent 10 years looking for a way to fill the hole he left behind, even if she had never admitted it to herself. If she fell into his embrace again, what would she do the next time he decided that he didn't want her anymore? The two got down to business, neither mentioning the earlier matters again. For a moment, it didn't even look like they had once shared a romantic relationship at all. Chaosheir had somewhat expected Silas to keep pressing, but she had almost forgotten the kind of man he was. His pride was placed above everything. If he could fluster her a bit, he would. But the moment he sensed that she had made up her mind for the moment, he pretended as though nothing at all had happened. It was enough to leave her one part frustrated and another part relieved. Honestly speaking, if Silas really decided he wanted to be pushy, she wasn't sure how long she could say no for. Of course, if anything happened between them, she would be sure to deny it all the next morning. But the moment that Pandora's box was open, there would be no closing it again. So she would prefer to avoid that at all costs. It wasn't long before Silas got a firm understanding of the sort of situation chaosheir was in. She had managed to raise the enclave to the ground, which had opened up the path for Castlemaine to return to the top 10. In addition, she had managed to clear the common leg of her chain quest as well. There were about 2.5 years remaining in chaosheir's quest, and the fact she was still working on the bronze leg even now was truly worrying. It would only get more difficult from here, and a 4-month pace for a common leg of a chain quest didn't bode well for the rest. This was especially troublesome because after listening to chaosheir complain about her troubles, Silas remembered something extremely important. Path of the Executioner, Bronze Quest. You have displayed a tenacious will and a sharp intent for battle, but you are missing the final piece to your power. Following the path of another is easy, following your own is much more difficult. The Executioner is the reaper of all, but wreathed in bad karma and a flagrant temper, their luck also tends to be particularly bad. Taking up this mantle will put you in untold danger, and many more will chase you down for your arrogance. Open up the path of the Executioner or die trying. Bronze reward requirements. Greater than behead 10,000 enemies 10 or more levels above you. Greater than extinguish a bronze evil cult. Wreathed in bad karma and a flagrant temper, their luck also tends to be particularly bad. A deep-seated worry sprouted in Silas's heart. After taking down the enclave, pretty much nothing had gone well for chaosheir. Professor Broussard, the traitor pegged by Silas, was ramping up efforts, coordinating with Guis City to help suppress the memory merchant and chaosheir's father. Chaosheir's steward summon, Gregory, was slowly clawing back power with the help of a new summon who went by Matilda, throwing Castlemaine's civil war into a cold one. And, with the ocean still pouring into the Amazonian wilds, there was pretty much no usable land around any longer. No one had found a method to close it yet. Of course, Silas now knew the perfect method, but it would require conquering the system cities. If it was that easy, chaosheir would have done it already. Her luck, it's the problem. Chapter 535, Listen. The path of the Executioner was one that came with great strength but at the cost of low luck. Chaosheir must have been particularly favored because the quest gave her the ability to offset that poor luck out of the gate. Unfortunately, that treasure was stolen away, taken by Lauren, who now had the number 1 spot on the merit leaderboard all to herself. And according to chaosheir, her rewards for the common quest leg were actually far less than what she received for the fragmented part of the quest. Silas hadn't really considered this aspect of things before, but what if the use of the necklace wasn't to give chaosheir great luck, but to instead place her on a level playing field with everyone else? Although everyone was facing problems of their own, chaosheir seemed to be outsized. This sounded ridiculous to say when Silas was facing the rage of two heir candidates and the government, as well as the system on top of that. But most of the problems Silas had gotten into were forced by his hands or inevitable due to his starting circumstances. By comparison, chaosheir's bad luck seemed much more random and coincidental. After all, chaosheir wasn't born into a family like the Grimblades, and she wasn't scouted by legacy, as far as Silas knew, when she was young either. She had started off her village in the middle of nowhere, and it didn't seem like a particularly strategic point either. She just placed it down as soon as she could so that she would have some method of self-protection. And yet, she had ended up with not just one, but two compromised spawns. There was a system city right next to her that not only had sylphs but ones that wanted to target her specifically. The Enclave had been close enough to affect her progress, but far enough away that they were a headache to deal with, and the cherry on top of all of that was that a portal had appeared right above her head, leading right to a government official wielding way too much power who also happened to want to deal with her. And not a single one of these things was a result of any prior action or background on the part of chaosheir. If Silas was correct and things continued like this, it was likely that her luck would only boil over and grow worse. In fact, this bad luck was likely proportional to her current class grade. It had only gotten worse after her class progressed to common. I have to get the necklace back for her. Silas' gaze flashed. Okay, go back now and be sure to protect yourself. Chaosheir rolled her eyes. I don't need you to tell me that. Silas would have replied, but his mind was already elsewhere. He was trying to build out a plan in his mind. Even if it meant standing against Legacy and forging yet another enemy for himself, he needed to get that necklace back. Or else. He was certain that chaosheir wouldn't survive the fallout. He vanished soon after, leaving chaosheir alone in the small coffee shop landscape. She shook her head and sighed. She had trouble reading Silas sometimes, but at others, he might as well have been an open book to her. This was one of those latter times. When he was worried, he didn't say anything. He just worked harder, and right now he was worried about her. Maybe that was the one constant. Whether they were together or not. He had always been overprotective. Chaosheir couldn't help but smile lightly. There was a silence that had hung over the office for a while now. Lucius sat behind his desk, reclined in his chair, taking a sip of what looked like a hard, brown liquor from time to time. Though he didn't seem to be abusing the substance considering his calm demeanor and unhurried sips, the half-empty bottle on the table told a different story. Still, all things considered, he was still well-dressed, his expression, though a bit flushed, was still healthy, and his breathing was steady and rhythmic. However, if one could see his status window, one would see that he was staring at the same system-wide message. In fact, he had been staring at it just like this for the last 2 days. There was a click at his door, and Nathan walked in. He carried the same carefree demeanor and had clearly recovered long before Lucius had. But that was because the next steps weren't any skin off his back. It had only taken Nathan a minute to tell Lucius what to do if he wanted to survive. It couldn't have been simpler, really, give up his right to the competition of heirs and return to the Grimblade family. If Lucius insisted on staying in the Evergreen territory, he would die. If he tried to escape and rebuild in a new territory, he would die. Pretty much anything he did that required having his cake and eating it too would result in death. He had sacrificed a great deal in exchange for Silas' death, and now that he had failed, he would have to sacrifice more to avoid his own. Bloom is awake now, Nathan said. What did she say? He's alive. We know that much already. The rest, I mean, Lucius said calmly. The warrant worked. Or, I should say that it's working even now. A full 50% reduction. Yup. What about his professions? It was suppressed for what looks like 2 hours or so before rebounding. So you mean to say the plan went quite smoothly? Precisely. And it still didn't work. Exactly right. He had given up the city he spent half a year of his blood, sweat, and tears on. He had given up the right to claim ownership over the Evergreen territory. He had even harmed Bloom, who would likely be unable to use her profession in such a way for months, if not years. All for nothing. Lucius stood, pouring the rest of his whiskey into the pot of a nearby plant. He had enough. I will listen to you this time. Let's return to the Grimblades. I will give up my heirship rights. Nathan nodded in silence, but he couldn't help but wonder if this was really where it would end. Chapter 536, Rogue. Silas left the Nexus with a frown on his face and a hint of darkness to his aura. He didn't particularly have an opinion about Lauren before. He wasn't the sort of person to get angry just because someone betrayed him, because if the shoe was on the other foot, and it benefited him, he would surely do much the same thing. During this summoning, he had already killed many people that didn't quite deserve it, and as things progressed, and beasts began to exhibit intelligence closer and closer to that of humans and the Basilisk King, the moral quandaries that might affect others would continue to have no impact on him at all. As such, though he had labeled Lauren as an enemy, it wasn't to the point he felt the need to hunt her down to the ends of the earth. But now things had changed. She was affecting someone he cared for, and there would have to be hell to pay for that. However, he would need to find her first. The African continent had a somewhat unique system of governance compared to olden Earth, but it was more common nowadays. Because the entirety of Earth had been split into just 7 countries as opposed to the hundreds of the past, there were certain unique measures that had to be taken so that such large bodies of land could be placed beneath one umbrella. The African continent's approach was a quasi-constitutional monarchy where there were actually 3 acting monarchs and royal families. There was the Sereno family of the north, the Kintara family of the Middle Plains, and the Talira family of the south. These 3 families were led by Queen Amara Sereno, King Roderick Kintara, and King Thorian Talira. Should these 3 figures make the same decision, the country would almost certainly follow suit. The united power could overwhelm the parliamentary system. In the past, this power of theirs was executed rarely and was much like the England of old. Their families acted as figureheads, and though they would encroach from time to time on normal government function, they would mostly be in ceremonial roles. After the summoning, however, things had changed a great deal. The 3 royal families took the reins and stirred the country forward. But their forcefulness also caused the African continent to be one of the best-positioned countries in the world currently. While the united coalition of Terra Nova was being bogged down by democracy and the logistics of coordinating the thoughts and actions of several figures in positions of power, the African continent had circumvented much of that. Still, this might have been good news for them, but it was less so for Silas, who was now situated in the middle of King Roderick's territory. The saving grace was that the population of all countries, regardless of governance style, was at an all-time low, leaving large swaths of land completely unmanned. However, it still wasn't long before King Roderick's men had pinpointed the likely location of the woodland territory. The location was a room surrounded by large concrete tiles, each one of which must have been at least 2 meters in length and width. They lined the room in a way that would make any handyman worth his salt wonder just what kind of manpower it took to do this, and also what kind of craftsmanship it took to hide the door. There certainly had to be one. After all, in this box-shaped room, there were several figures present, all of whom were surrounding another concrete piece. This time, it was a table adorned with a 3-dimensional map of the African continent. This map was quite interesting because only the central plane was detailed, while the intricacies of the craftsmanship on the north and south of it were much murkier. King Roderick sat at the helm of the table. He was a man with fierce amber eyes, tanned skin, and a beard that looked almost like it was chiseled out of obsidian rather than grown onto his face. He didn't wear a normal crown, but instead had a thin metallic band of bronze around his head. The rest of his style of dress was casual, just a pair of dress pants and a shirt with rolled-up sleeves. It should be around here. It's still a decently sized area, about a 100-kilometer radius, but was certain that this is where the territory has appeared. A tricky location to be sure, another official spoke up. That region is rife with poisonous beasts. Targeting it would be tricky no matter what, but that's certainly another problematic wrinkle. It's outside of our calculations that a warlord would appear so quickly. Several things about this summoning aren't going as we might have thought before. A silence fell over the room. King Roderick's forearms rippled with veins and muscles as he tapped his finger on his crossed arms. He seemed to be lost in thought, half listening to his officials, and half focused on something else. He let his officials speak for a while longer before saying something himself. Have we heard back from Amara yet? Yes, my liege, the excavation is almost complete. Within a month, there will be movement and time for us to set out. This timing isn't great, then, King Roderick said, as though speaking to himself. What should we do? Scylla's Grimblade, King Roderick said slowly. His name has appeared many times now, but his actions are erratic. Originally, we believed him to be one of the Grimblades, but the more I learn about him, the more it seems that the Grimblades have no jurisdiction over his actions. He's a rogue. King Roderick nodded. The officials seemed troubled. If Scylla's was really a rogue, and they recontextualized all of his previous feats, it made him far greater of a threat. A rogue didn't have nearly the same constraints to worry about. We won't interfere in this matter directly, we do not have the time. Instead, we'll use the powers that are already there. Divert some resources and give them a bit of support. They'll have a vested interest in keeping him constrained. Take advantage of that for the moment until we return. Chapter 537, Rune Breath Secret Realm 1. The Life of Runes Secrets. Limited access, Rune Breath must be awakened, cost, 3 million, F, coins. Scylla stood in the first door, gazing ahead with a calm expression. He seemed to have never been so focused before, and his comprehension of runes was quickly getting fuller and sharper. Without the influence of the system cities, the runes of Earth, at least in this region, were healing somewhat. It seemed impossible for them to turn all the way back to what they had once been, but the small changes alone made Scylla feel what he should from Rune's soul with much more clarity. This left him confused in part, though. If there was such a drastic change between a partially healed and unhealed Earth, then why didn't he feel this difference so clearly while he was in the Sylph dungeon? Wasn't it located off Earth? It was either that location was influenced by the connection it formed with Earth. Or Earth wasn't the only world targeted by this figure in the background. Scylla didn't find this to be too surprising. Considering the odd occurrences that took place after he left the Sylph dungeon, and his run-in with the Sylph prince he had replaced for the event, it was clear that the Sylphs very clearly weren't a single cohesive power. Someone had tried to target him and suffered for it, and there were likely others that didn't take too kindly to their interference. The question was, just which of those factions had the upper hand, and how could he take advantage of it? These questions, though, were too far from him for now. He instead just basked in the clarity of the runes. They communicated with him with much greater strength now. As he moved through the doors one by one, he took his time. He didn't want to accidentally miss the core purpose of his secret realm like he almost had in the world of runes. This Rune Breath secret realm was truly no different. It too held a profound truth, and the challenges were much more taxing on Scylla. It took him an entire hour just to pass through the first door. If rune enlightenment was gaining the instinct for what a rune could do just by seeing it, Rune Breath was a step further, building up on the first 3 stages to create a holistic feel for runes. It was said that the breath of the title Rune Breath referred to the life of the rune, and some often mistook that for a rune master breathing life into a rune. However, this wasn't quite accurate because the entire hidden truth of this secret realm was that runes already had a life of their own. Scylla entered the second door, finding himself in an even more complex landscape. In the first door, he was presented with a 3x3 grid of runes for a total of 9. This time, it was a 4x4 grid for a total of 16. In order to pass the first door, he had to arrange the 9 runes in such a way that they would spontaneously combine into one. If the runes had tangible purposes, it would have been easier, and maybe he would have succeeded in a few minutes. But the trouble was that the runes were, well, nonsense, for lack of a better descriptor. They completely skirted the geometry rules Scylla's learned in the rune visualization secret realm, and they made use of strokes and foundations that wouldn't even get off the ground if not for the fact the secret realm was forcefully stabilizing them. If one did the math, a 3x3 grid of an arrangement of 9 different objects could be put into almost 400,000 different configurations. Still, this number was something you could brute force if you really pushed it. However, a 4x4 grid with 16 different items could be arranged in the order of 20 trillion different ways. If you didn't know what you were doing, you could spend your entire life here and still make it nowhere. Scylla stood in silence for an entire 3 hours. He hardly blinked, his arms crossed over his chest as the 16 runes before him became his entire world. He didn't seem to bore or tire as he allowed this world of runes to swallow him whole. Then, his hand suddenly moved. He swiped down, pulling the top right rune down to the square just above the bottom left corner. The moment he made a decision, he didn't slow. In a blink, he made several movements. This even row X column grid was harder than the first, not just because of the number difference, but because it didn't have a core rune. Because there were an even number, there was no middle square. As such, Silas had to find a way to balance the repulsion of the 4 middle squares. But the problem was that he had found 136 different configurations that worked to balance the core, but most of them didn't have a balance that would allow the outer core to fuse everything together. Then there were the particularly tricky ones that seemed to allow some fusion, but it would be incomplete or imperfect. However, the configuration that Silas settled on, WHOOOSH. The runes trembled as the last one snapped into place. The 4 core runes, as though they had been infused with magnets, snapped together, forming a Frankenstein rune that spun once and then sucked the surrounding runes into it. SHHOOO. A blinding light echoed out, and when Silas' vision cleared, he was standing on the white, cloudy path outside. Still, his gaze was unfocused. He absent-mindedly walked to the next door to find a 5x5 grid waiting for him. He stared at it for a long while, but this time, he wasn't calculating anything. Silas knew that he was missing something. If he continued to calculate like this, he would eventually succeed, but it would take months to make it to the end. What would he do when he reached a 10x10 grid? This 5x5 grid was easier, and it would only take him half an hour because it had a core rune he could make use of. But the even grids would take him months by the time he got to 10x10. He didn't have that kind of time. But that didn't make sense. Why did a core make a difference? Unless. I see. Silas' green irises blazed with a furious light. Chapter 538, 999. Silas felt that he finally understood. The reason for starting with one core instead of an amalgamation of cores was that it set the precedent and tone for the rest of the movement. But without this, there were too many potential cores to choose from. Just the first even grid had over 130 options. This made Silas unsure of which direction to take things in. He got lost in trying to find the proper combinations but didn't spend enough time trying to understand the guiding principle that allowed it all to work. What was it that drove the runes to fuse into one? It was like rune visualization and enlightenment all over again, but an application at a much higher level. In the rune visualization secret realm, he learned about geometry and how to listen to runes and fit them into configurations their strokes and foundations most like to be in. In the rune enlightenment secret realm, he built on this, learning how to use the laws of the world around him to form runes more naturally and fluidly. Now, Rune Breath was just asking him to apply what he had already learned. Take it a step further, build on those principles, and display the true power of runes. Even if these were nonsense runes, there was a guiding principle that brought it all together. And if he stopped observing these runes one by one and took a step back to observe them as a whole instead. This time, Silas only observed for a short while before his aura burst. He didn't even use his hands any longer, using his rune soul to apply pressure on the runes before him so that they naturally flowed the way they were meant to. WOOOSH. The 16 runes flashed and were sucked into a vortex. They didn't even bother to arrange themselves properly, flowing in a 3-dimensional spiral pattern until they clamped together. A blinding light, even fiercer than the last door, echoed out, and by the time Silas' vision cleared, he was once again on the outside. This time, he had still cheated a bit. He used the one core rune to guide everything else. But still, it was much faster than before, where it took him an entire hour for a much simpler puzzle. Now, however, he stepped into the 4th door, facing off against the 6x6 grid in front of him. Now, there were no core runes. He would once again have to find the 2x2 set that would work for the core. But this time it was even more difficult. That was because encased around the core 2x2 grid was a 4x4 grid, all before the surrounding 6x6. He needed to find 2 working cores this time, increasing the problems several-fold. Silas could feel his wisdom really being pushed this time. He knew that he couldn't have found the perfect method just yet. This secret realm was designed for those that had just grasped Rune Breath, but he was an entire 2 levels beyond that. It didn't make sense that he was struggling so much at door 4 when there was still 5 more. However, giving up wasn't exactly in his vocabulary. There was definitely something here. There was no doubt in his mind. What Silas didn't know was that he was struggling so much only because the runes of Earth were so warped and twisted. What he was trying to do was the equivalent of getting an elite marathon runner to run in the Olympics with a weighted vest that doubled what he had to carry. How could you use rune breath effectively when all the life of your world's runes had practically been ruthlessly snuffed out? The only reason Silas could even begin to progress so much was because he had rune soul. But the more he pushed himself, the more his wisdom began to tick up. He was so focused that he didn't notice his mind pressing against its barrier and leaping over its limits. He pushed his rune soul to the limits, looking and searching for a breakthrough. He didn't find it in the fourth door. It took him over an hour, even with his new insights, to make it to the next door. Yet, the fifth door, as a result, took him no more than 3 minutes, even with the added complexity of a 7x7 grid. When he faced off against the sixth door, his eyes were blazing as he faced the 8x8 grid. He felt he was close. The runes were calling out to him, almost begging to spring free of the cocoons. But they were stifled and boarded up. They couldn't show the true selves off, suffocated by the cancers growing through them and the damage to their laws. Greater than wisdom, 955. Greater than wisdom, 957. Greater than wisdom, 962. The numbers of Silas' unsuppressed wisdom continued to rise. Although the wisdom he could access now was only half of that, he didn't have a mind for it, trying to see through more, understand more. Subconsciously, his rune soul and his sixth sense began to fuse in ways they weren't meant to. The world of his visualization changed, and instead of seeing things in shapes, size, and color, his visualization began to see them as arrays of runes. He didn't see the color blue, he saw what runes caused every other color to be absorbed. He didn't see walls, he saw the very laws and constructs that made them so sturdy. He didn't see people, he was starting to peer beyond, seeing the mesh of runes that formed their genes, the underlying specialness of their blood essence, and deeper than that, their very souls. Greater than wisdom, 997. Greater than wisdom, 998. Greater than wisdom, 999. There was a sudden surge as Silas crossed the 1000 wisdom barrier without realizing it in the slightest. The suppression on his mental rippled, and he shattered it, still not noticing in the slightest. But he did suddenly find that his analysis accelerated, and then all of a sudden, he broke free of the sixth door. Chapter 539, Push Through. Silas took deep breaths as he appeared on the cloudy road once again. He felt as though he had already hit his limit. Despite the sudden surge at the end, his brain was almost entirely drained. It was difficult for him to even breathe properly. It was like all the nerves in his body were overloaded. Without knowing the exact reason he was struggling so much, his gaze couldn't help but be solemn. It was no wonder Nosfaline took rune breath so seriously. Excavating one's potential in this rune mastery realm wasn't easy by any means. Even if he knew he was struggling so much because of the suppression on Earth's runes, his reaction wouldn't be much different. That was because whoever could do this suppressing a generation of rune masters was definitely on a level he couldn't fathom. He would have to push himself even harder. With his jaw set, he walked toward the seventh door. When he entered, he exhaled a long, cold breath. It wasn't a 9x9 grid like he was expecting. Instead, it was a 3x3 grid once again. Or so it seemed until it was multiplied 3 times over. Before him, a 3x3x3 cube floated, each cubicle within carrying a different rune. Although there was a core rune he could take advantage of this time, the configurations were so much more numerous that it was impossible to fathom. Now that he needed to consider not just the two-dimensional aspects but the three-dimensional, it was like there were far more than just 27 runes before him. If each of the runes had dozens of configurations they could be rotated into, then he was being asked to arrange that many runes. Rather than 27 runes, there might as well be thousands in front of him now. This cube might seem to be on a smaller scale than the 8x8 grid he had just completed, but its level of complexity was on a whole other level. Silas took a breath and felt that he was at a crossroads. His mind was mush, and there were still 2 more doors after this, which were undoubtedly several-fold more complicated. But for some reason, he didn't want to give up. He felt like he was letting someone else win, even if it didn't make any sense. The feeling of discomfort was subtle, and he somewhat felt like it was an itch at the back of his mind. Something inside of him was stoked, and he almost glared at the cube-shaped grid hovering before him. A flicker of a flame danced within his eyes, and he focused on the task at hand. At that moment, it was like a dam had broken in his mind. He didn't have a sudden breakthrough. It was instead like he was a person who was staring at the answers he needed right in front of him yet hadn't noticed until now. With Rune Soul matched with his visualization, he was already naturally able to see runes in a three-dimensional form. But why was it that he had only been considering one aspect of them until now? He had been lulled into that sense of security because the grids until now had all been two-dimensional, so he was only considering what the runes looked like straight on. He didn't even think to rotate them. He closed his eyes, going back as he tried to think through something. When he returned to the puzzle of the second door, he realized the 136 configurations for the core runes could all be used. All he had to do was likewise change the configuration of the surrounding runes, rotating them here and there. He had always been under the assumption that these grids only had one solution. Maybe there was only one perfect solution, and that was the solution he had been chasing all along, but there were certainly several other possibilities as well. However, just because those other possibilities weren't perfect didn't mean that they wouldn't help in finding the best solution. When you were working with the laws of the world, a single stroke or foundation could have several functions that it could possibly execute. There was just one water molecule in existence, but that didn't mean that it could be in a state of liquid, solid, or gas, nor did it mean that it couldn't have different ways it acted while under high pressure or low pressure. But each one could be considered water no less than any of the others. Hydro dams and steam engines both used water to generate power, but the methods in which they did so couldn't have been more different. The various configurations of a rune and how he could fit them together were much the same. Trying to fit himself into one box would have always been foolish. However, because the runes were nonsense runes without form or function, Scylla's analytical mind had a hard time looking at them like he normally did, so he tried to brute force it through other methods. Ironically, whether it was his disposition or the fact he already had Rune Soul, they had only held him back in this respect. First, he tried to calculate it rigorously, then when that was slowing down, he used his Rune Soul to force them to flow to the correct configuration. When instead, Scylla's pulled on the laws of the world, and the runes shifted and began to spin. Click, click, click. As though gears snapping into place, they resonated at each step until they settled into one position. Then, the runes began to swap and shift in relation to one another. At that moment, a piercing light shot up, striking a hole through the canopy of the secret realm. The glow of Scylla's eyes only grew fiercer. He didn't care to see the end of the phenomena, leaving and entering the 8th door, only to leave it soon after and enter the 9th. The secret realm shook. Scylla finally awoke from his state of focus, blinking. Something is happening. Chapter 540. The Rune Master Guild has taken an interest in you. Would you like to accept a system conference? A system conference. Scylla wasn't sure what that was, but after convening with the Madness Key, he realized that it was just a formal method of connecting two separate branches of the system. Essentially, it was a voice call. Obviously, though, whoever was on the other side was footing the bill. And judging by the hints that Madness Key dropped, this bill certainly wasn't a small one. Not only was it a matter of distance, but the fact Earth was still in the middle of its summoning meant that its connection with this tier of the universe wasn't solidified yet. Meaning, the cost was easily thousands of times more than what one would expect. What is the Rune Master Guild? The Rune Master Guild is not a single guild, but rather a network of them. They work under the same umbrella, using the moniker of Rune Master Guild as a facade to allow free exchange of ideas and trade. The explanation was quick, but Scylla's got the gist of it. So it wasn't actually the Rune Master Guild that was contacting him, but more than likely one of its many understudies. The Rune Master Guild would probably be more accurately seen as an alliance of various smaller guilds. His thoughts only seemed to be proven more correct when there was a second notification, and then a third. I see, they're probably using the official umbrella of the Rune Master Guild as a little white lie. It was almost like a subsidiary mentioning their parent company. Technically, it was true that they were one and the same, but in practice, were they really? The same notification repeated again and again, and Silas was quickly finding it annoying. They had probably found out that he was from a world in the middle of their summoning and wanted to take advantage of him. But to Silas, every connection made with the outside world cost him time he couldn't afford to lose. The balancing between the time dilation here on Earth and in the outside world would have to be compensated for somehow. And by now, he had already asked enough questions to the Madness Key to know that there was a great deal of danger lurking on the other side if he made a deal with the wrong guild. Young and talented rune masters getting locked up into contracts that practically signed their souls away wasn't an uncommon occurrence at all. If it was just as simple as reading the contract and calling it a day, Silas would certainly do so. But these people were experts in runes that were far beyond him. His experience in the rune breath secret realm had made him realize that there was a far taller mountain to climb out there. The contracts of the Rune Master Guild weren't written in plain language, otherwise, anyone smart enough to be acknowledged by a guild would be able to see through the tricks. The problem was that the contracts were constructed in runes, and unless it was formed by two parties with equal skill, it was like handing control of your life over to another. And Silas certainly wasn't going to try to rely on his will to form a contract. Who knew how many quadruple, quintuple, or sextuple digit will masters there were lurking around in the universe? No matter how he looked at it, whether it was the time he would lose to the dilation or the danger involved. Even if there were benefits to be gained, until he was more confident in himself or had a better understanding of the scope of the world on the outside, he couldn't afford to take this step. In the end, he rejected all of the invitations he received. A Rune Master Guild verified member has taken an interest in you. Would you like to accept a conference? When Silas saw this in the string of notifications, he was even more certain in his earlier assessment. There was a string of invites first that only mentioned the Rune Master Guild, and now there was suddenly this verified member. He shut it all down, closing himself off to these notifications from the Rune Master Guild. If they were going to keep coming like this, he would never get any peace. Luckily, the system had a function for muting only certain types of notifications. What Silas didn't know was that the very first notification he received wasn't a scam. It was well and truly from the Rune Master Guild. As for why? In a common hub of the universe, there was a great deal of hustle and bustle. The city seemed formed of countless floating, oblong pods that orbited around in fixed intervals. It was said that this was meant to be based around complex concepts of city planning, moving highly frequented pods toward locations with more access and more lanes of traffic during their peak hours, and away from those locations when they closed down or were off-peak. It was a magical sight to behold, and near the central core of this city was the one standing building that never moved anywhere. A towering monument of curving glass structures, it stood tall and proud. This was the headquarters of the Rune Master Guild of this quadrant of the universe. And right now, there was a great uproar taking place. District Head, something big's happened. A middle-aged man who looked to be getting on in his years looked up. There was a slit in the middle of his forehead and an almost dull, careless sort of arrogance in his eyes as he lazily looked up. He seemed annoyed to be interrupted, but he still waited for the explanation. There's a new addition to the top 1,000. He's human on an unsummoned world. Only now did the man seem to arouse from his annoyance, his eyes flashing with brilliance. 341. Silas Grimblade, LVO, Human, F. 342. Ulrich Vekunish, LV 37, Thriskai, F. Planet Thrix, Grade 2 Silver. Chapter 541, Smarts Aren't Enough. The Breath Master list was based on one thing and one thing only, how fast the Rune Breath secret realm was cleared. Any existence younger than the age of 51 and within the F grade was allowed to be on it. Though there was no universal list, the logistics of documenting so many secret realm entries across so many quadrants were far too great. Instead, this list was based by district, while there were probably hundreds of districts in just a single galaxy and about 4 to 5 solar systems to a district. To Earth, it seemed as though most solar systems were lifeless, but this was only because most of the universe was closed off to them due to their failure to complete the summoning. In reality, of the thousands of solar systems in the Milky Way, all of them had at least one planet with life on them, maybe multiple planets and moons at that. Each one of these solar systems would have anywhere from millions in population due to situations like Earth, where the summoning was not long ago and most had died, to tens of billions. Situations like Earth was still relatively rare because it wasn't every day that a world underwent a summoning. As such, one could expect about 10 to 30 billion people a solar system, which meant about 50 to 150 billion people a district. When you elevated the scale to a galaxy, there were probably upward of a few 100 trillion people. This was all to say that making it into a top 1,000 list for one of the most commonly challenged secret realms was no joking matter. However, to make it as an unsummoned was another matter entirely. To do so as a human, well, there were probably a dozen or so races on the list, many of whom could be found dotted across the universe, appearing in many galaxies and districts. But the number of humans, or more specifically, as they were known across the universe, primitive humans. Scylla's was the only one on the list. There was not a single other primitive human. This reality made Scylla's a hot commodity. As he had expected, the number of individuals who wanted to take advantage of him could wrap an entire line across the district. In fact, there were some spies from other districts who had spies within theirs who perked up as well, wondering how they might take advantage of this situation. The trouble was that in this sea of fishermen fishing in troubled waters, there were those that genuinely wanted to bring Scylla's into their fold as well. Unfortunately, Scylla's simply didn't have the time to properly vet these people and could only make the one choice he could. And in typical Scylla's fashion, his action of directly ignoring this throng of invitations was poorly received. The scammers from unverified guilds were one thing, they just shrugged their shoulders and moved on to their next target. But as the messages from verified guilds began to pile up, and then named guilds began to get involved soon after, followed by ranked guilds, the legend of Scylla's arrogance piled up. No one seemed to care about his reasons. In fact, those that could become rune masters were all smart enough to see through them. However, did they have a reason to care? Not only did Scylla's ignore them, but he didn't bother to respond to even a single one of them. And soon enough, news of this began to spread around as well. District Head Mosferal sat in his office, listening to the reports. His face seemed to be just as expressionless, but there was a keen light in his eyes that betrayed a smile. He knew things about the world that most of these rune masters didn't, enough to know that Scylla's wasn't just being overly cautious for the sake of it. If Scylla's could make the guesses Mosferal thought he might, then this matter would very quickly get blown out of proportion very soon. This matter would reach the ears of those Scylla's likely hoped it wouldn't. This level of fanfare was practically equivalent to a change in the top 10, all because of the circumstances surrounding Scylla's. "You're smart," District Head Mosferal suddenly spoke. All of his attendants fell into silence, none responding. They knew of Mosferal's habit of speaking to himself. Unfortunately, in this world, being smart alone isn't enough. Sometimes you have to be smart enough to know when to take a loss on purpose. Not every situation can be a perfect win. For you. It's too bad. You've probably gotten comfortable with being number one on your little planet. If you can manage to complete your summoning, we'll see how far that takes you. What District Head Mosferal hadn't said was that it had been a very long time since a world completed their summoning in the 9 tries given. So long, in fact, that the last to succeed had already become the overlords of his district. There was a reason they called this the Sky Galaxy. They might not have perfect dominion over every district, but there was no district that couldn't feel their influence. The slit on Mosferal's forehead suddenly opened and a blinding red light filled the room. Scylla's had no idea about what was happening on the other side of the district, but he was smart enough to make guesses. The possibility that his actions could infuriate people wasn't lost on him, it was just that he didn't have the luxury to care right now. It was now just yet another future problem he would have to deal with. But if he ended up in someone's clutches right here and now, his race against time would likewise end here and now. If he could push off benefits to the future for the sake of his foundation, he could push off problems too. Right now, he was only interested in what the evolved Mansa wand could give him. With a thought, he brought out the crystalline tree. Chapter 542, Mansa's Blossom. Mansa's Blossom, Silver, Ether Treasure. The paths of the Mansa are long and complex. There is no one path that is superior to another, but the distance one can travel depends greatly on your strength of heart. The Mancer's Blossom allows you to feel and sense your path of the Mancer, how to progress it and how to improve it. Feed the Mancer's Blossom ether and it will bear fruit to enlighten your path. Meditate beneath the Mancer's Blossom to improve ether recovery and gain a chance to level up. Silas stared at the tree for a long while. He could feel the fatigue of the rune breath secret realm slowly being peeled away under his circulation of less than mad and enlightenment greater than. But he was also somewhat aware that unless he went to bed, he likely wouldn't get back to 100%. It was a shame because he had already called another general in for his next round of grappling practice. It seemed he would have to send them back and hold off until he woke up from this coming nap. But before he did that, he still had an urge to check the evolved Mancer's wand. It had to be remembered that this evolution of the Mancer's wand was triggered because it saved him from being forcefully leveled up to level 50. Since then, he hadn't had a chance to take advantage of it. But technically speaking, if he meditated beneath his Mancer's Blossom ether treasure, he should be able to sense runes far more powerful than his current slow and freeze ice poison runes. Maybe he would find runes approaching 100 foundations. But the problem with this was obvious. His affinity was no longer just purely ice and poison. He had a third affinity now, wood. Part of him wanted to hope that since Mancer's Blossom took the shape of a tree, it would have a natural affinity to the element that he could take advantage of. But a single glance told him that that wasn't going to happen. When he asked the Madness Key how he would go about adding another affinity to it, it gave him two possibilities. Either he would need to reach the same level in wood ether on his own, or he would need to find a source at the same level as what triggered the evolution in the first place. While Mancer's Blossom was a far greater treasure than Mancer's wand, by extension, it was also less flexible. There was one thing he was right about, though. So Mancer's Blossom might not have a natural wood elemental ether affinity to it, but it does have a natural proclivity for the element. Mancer's wand was a wooden branch that grew into Mancer's Blossom, a tree at its root. But there was still a subtle difference. According to the Madness Key, wood was actually a version or mutation of earth ether that incorporated a higher form of ether that could nurture and give life. Silas wasn't able to learn what this special ether was because the cost of genes to learn it was too steep. It wasn't worthwhile to learn it now, not when he wouldn't be able to use it anyway. This must be why my new class came with an earth affinity as well. That means that compared to other elements, Mancer's Blossom should have an easier time incorporating earth and wood. But I need to find something that's worthy of it. Silas took a breath and the frosty air fueled his body. There was also something else. Mancer's Blossom was a tree. Using it like this, balancing it on hard floors, not allowing it to seep its roots into soil, also caused its effects to be weaker than they should be. Before, Silas had nowhere to plant it, so he didn't even consider it. But now that he technically had his own territory here, maybe he should consider it. This is the woodland territory. I don't believe that I won't be able to find something to help it incorporate this new path. Feeling somewhat comfortable in the cold, Silas returned to his bed and fell asleep once again. His mind seemed to be massaged by the hands of angels while he was resting because when he woke up, he felt like a completely new person. When he exhaled, a string of icicles came from his lips, and he was shocked to find that ice poison runes were naturally forming. He was even more shocked when he looked beneath his feet. Every step he took came with another blossoming of ice. They almost formed a lotus platform for his personal use. This isn't ether. Not really. Silas was stunned, but he was certain of what he was seeing. Sure, the density of ether in the surroundings had something to do with it, but this wasn't because of his rune mastery. He had reached a point where he subconsciously formed runes, without effort and without even the input of his wisdom. In fact, the formation of the runes seemed to have no impact on his mental fatigue at all. This would be impossible if the ice poison in the air hadn't grown so thick while he was asleep. But this meant that so long as there was an abundance of ether he had a close affinity with. It wouldn't take any stamina at all to have runes heed his call. Was this rune essence? No, that wasn't right. Rune essence didn't have a description like this one. This felt a lot more like rune spark according to what he understood. But had he really leapt another 3 levels in his sleep? That didn't feel right either. It took Silas a half hour of contemplation and the Madness Key's help before he understood exactly what was happening. And from what he understood, there was both a simple answer and a complicated one. The simple answer was that this was a result of a combination of efforts including Mance's bloom, his rune soul, his warlord title, and the healing of the runes in this region thanks to the destruction of 2 system cities. As for the complicated one, it could be summarized in a single line. Chapter 543, Interesting. This was a window into Rune Spark. It could indeed be summarized in one line, but the implications were both heavy and complicated. It meant several important things. First, Rune Spark and ether affinity and ether control could not be separated from one another. Second, part of Rune Spark's formation incorporated the very same kingly aura that bronze beasts and above had. Third, he might very well never touch upon even Rune Essence, let alone Rune Spark, if he could manage to heal the runes of Earth to a better point than this. Rune Essence, Rune Vitality, Rune Spark. These were the 3 levels beyond Rune Soul, and each one was more difficult to grasp than the last. However, for whatever reason, Silas didn't find it to be very difficult. Instead, what was really holding him back was the world around him. What Silas didn't know was that there were many talents across the universe who were much like him. It was just that these talents were born into far higher races. The reason for this was that because rune mastery was divided into grades much like ether or levels might be. Being a rune breath master of the F grade didn't guarantee you'd be able to replicate the same feat in E grade. Every grade was another challenge, and there were many rune masters that never made it to the end of the road in one grade. Making it to Rune Soul was already an exceptionally rare event. That was why the unique gene of the Dogons was even more shocking. If they could manage to elevate themselves to the E grade, or maybe even the D grade beyond, and find the materials they needed to likewise upgrade their genes, they would immediately reach Rune Flesh. The more one understood about the power scaling of the universe, the more ridiculous these feats became. To the current Silas, however, not only was this a great distance away, but it also represented a great deal of work for himself. There was good news, though. Within his woodland territory, not only would he have the ability to suppress others and increase his strength, he would have a quasi-rune spark under his control in certain regions where the poison and wood ether were in especially high concentrations. And in this specific territory. That was in quite a number of places. However, that didn't mean that there was absolutely nothing he could do right now. Silas took a seat under the tree and entered a sort of state of focus. Soon, his mind had entered the world of the Mance's blossom. It reminded him a lot of the scene near the ice poison pond in the tundra regions north of the Evergreen territory. But the difference was that this time Mance's blossom carried this world around it wherever it went, whereas Mance's wand had to be in the presence of high ice poison concentrations to allow him to enter. Silas walked deeper into the world, and soon enough, he was surrounded by runes with 40 to 50 foundations. These were the absolute strongest runes that Silas had been able to find in the Mance's wand before, but now. He headed in deeper until his eyes landed on the first 60 foundation ice poison rune he had ever seen. The pressure in this region was absolutely astonishing. Silas could even feel that if not for the fact he had Rune Soul, his mind would have already frosted over. This is really the limit, huh? He was a bit disappointed. If he could get his hands on a 100 foundation ice poison rune, just how much more powerful would he be? Regardless of ether quality difference, the woodland spider queen would have died at his hands in just a few minutes at worst. However, the quality jump between a rune of around 50 foundations and one with around 60 was clear to see. Silas didn't feel any pressure at all around the last region. But in this one, he somewhat feared for his life. If he pushed it too much, he would end up harming himself. It seemed that he had severely underestimated runes before, and now that he was learning more about them and recalibrating somewhat, he understood just how impressive it was for him to be able to use 50 foundation runes at all. Even the woodland spider queen had only had runes around 30, closing in on 40 foundations. Silas pushed down his disappointment. A 60 foundation rune was easily 2 to 3 times more powerful than a 50 foundation rune. And unlike the Mance's wand where there were only a handful to choose from, there were hundreds here. The volume of choice was astounding. However, Silas felt that he already had a path he was envisioning for his Mance path. It would take a shocking change for him to divert from it. So, he stuck with that path, choosing 2 runes he called Advanced Slow and Advanced Freeze. They were exactly what they sounded like, souped-up versions of his current slow and freeze ice poison runes. Unfortunately, he couldn't just swap out the ether in his body for it now because his class wouldn't allow it. But, with his rune mastery, it was easy for him to incorporate it into his ether skin. Thanks to that, his ether skin went from having 400 natural defense to just over 1000. Someone would have to be capable of attacking with a strength of 1000 before they could even begin to stress his constitution. This change alone was worth it. But the changes to his skills were substantial as well. Silas exhaled a breath and put Mance's blossom away. Over the next 2 days, Silas pivoted back to grappling, refining all the way up to less than synchronized flow greater than, the FF plus skill, to legendary mastery. He planned to continue, but unfortunately, it seemed that spending an entire month moving at his own pace wasn't going to be allowed by his enemies. Nosfaline came to him with news. It turned out that there were a few leaders of the woodland territory that had sent representatives to speak with him. Silas' first thought wasn't apprehension or shock. Instead, he thought of just one question. How did they know he was staying in this system city? He had never announced his dominion at all. Was it just a guess because this was the last system city that remained in the territory? Or was it something else? Interesting. Chapter 544, Mine. Silas stepped into the large common room where there were 3 individuals waiting for him. Tassia Banks. Virgil Wright. Austin Beck. Not a single one of them had a level above 0. Silas doubted that it was because of a treasure. The odds of such a treasure being effective in his territory were next to nothing. That meant that these people simply had no levels at all. They were probably being nurtured to earn professions. Though he could see hints of nervousness in them, there was a professionalism there that made it obvious they had done this sort of thing for a living before the summoning. The difference was that before the summoning, Silas would have been thrown in jail for killing them. And now, there were no guardrails in place for them at all. Each one was hoping that Silas would have some etiquette in not killing the messengers. But they were likewise all willing to risk their lives for a chance to move up in their worlds. They were bold people. Silas kind of liked that. As for how long he would, time would tell. The only woman among them reacted first. She quickly stood, taking the initiative to come to Silas' side. Her eyes seemed to carry hints of brightness in them as she appeared before him, extending her hand. Hello, I'm Tassia Banks, as you've probably already seen. Tassia, like Anastasia, without the annoying fluff. I'm here representing Gothamshire. Tassia seemed to be in her early 20s. She wore business formal well, and her hair was done up into a tight bun. Silas noticed the single button she had undone. It was enough to see some soft flesh, but not enough to feel like she was overdoing it. She was riding the line between flirtation and business well, and compared to the others, she was first to react and first to take advantage of the situation. However, Silas was more focused on the name of the city. It told him a lot more about this situation than most knew. This wasn't because it had been in the top 10, it was likely never close. But rather, the name itself had a similar tone and feel to the top 10 ones during the trial. He remembered seeing that list for the first time and thinking that it was kind of sad. So many had chosen names from pop culture and based on puns because they didn't realize just how serious these matters would be. By the time they did, a majority of them had already died. Gothamshire was certainly another one of these, meaning, he was unlikely to be dealing with a powerful family right now. But that was also contradictory. If they're not from powerful factions, then how did they find me? The only explanation is that they're getting help from the dark. Ragnar shouldn't have the ability to do this. Right now, he's heavily injured and cut off from his usual resources. The Ravenclaw family is definitely located in the Africor continent, but if Ragnar returns, he'll be giving up his heirship. After going as far as to betray the human race, he definitely knows that there's no going back now. He won't give up so easily, so him returning to the Ravenclaws now is unlikely. If I had to guess, he's probably somewhere in my woodland territory, likely near the location of the underground city, biding his time, healing his injuries, etc. He won't make a move for at least another week, likely longer. He has no idea that I've given myself a 1-month timer. If I was him, I would assume that I'd want to build up a faction. Who would want to abandon their warlord territory? He likely thinks that he has time to set up and find a method to deal with me. So he'll keep an eye on the underground city because he knows that that's the one thing we have in common. Silas found that his thoughts were moving much more fluidly. He had always been sharp, but it wasn't just that he had become sharper, rather, that sharpness was flowing with more agility, more speed. Tassia hadn't even finished speaking when he deduced all of this. As for his conclusion, it could only mean that they were receiving help from the Africa continent constitution monarchy. They sure move fast. Though there was still a possibility that it was legacy, Silas felt that the government of this continent definitely edged them out. Silas reached out a hand and shook hers. Silas Grimblade. Of course, Tassia said with a happy smile. Everyone knows you, you're world famous by now. She held Silas' palm for an extra half second before letting go, looking every bit the part of an excited fangirl. She chatted away for a bit before Virgil and Austin couldn't stand by the side anymore. Virgil cleared his throat. Being the shorter of the two men, and even a bit shorter than Tassia herself, he seemed to have the smallest presence. But his voice was quite booming and deep. He sounded like he had been an announcer before the summoning. If we could get down to business, we could get this over with quicker so that we can all be out of one another's hair. Silas' expression didn't change, but Tassia apologized with a smile and took a step to the side. Indeed, she is smart. She did it on purpose. This way, any animosity I have will be directed toward these two, even though she likely came to say the very same things they did. Despite already realizing this, Silas didn't say anything. He wasn't the type of person to care about such things. Sure, what have you come here to say? Silas asked. Virgil looked toward Austin. We believe that we can have a working relationship. There isn't a need to butt heads over the woodland territory, Virgil began. Is that so? Silas asked. There indeed isn't a need. After all, the territory is mine. Chapter 545, Information. The atmosphere couldn't help but turn a bit tense. They knew well that their lives were on the line here. If they stepped over the bounds too much, Silas could very well lash out. Even if there was a fallout and revenge was eventually taken on their behalf, they wouldn't be here to enjoy it. At that point, what would the point be? Virgil took a breath. By the same token, though, if they didn't say what needed to be said and just scurried off with their tail between their legs, then there wouldn't be a chance for them to move up. We are authorized to tell you that if a working relationship cannot be formed, then it may cause friction. Because you want to rely on the Africa government? Silas asked plainly. The three froze. If you're smart enough to make it this far, then you also know that they're just using you. The fact that there means that either they want to use you all to probe my bottom line, or they're occupied with something more important than the sudden appearance of a warlord territory. Regardless of which it is, you're at most receiving superficial support right now. Maybe some information, some scouting, some treasures. But ultimately you'll be castaways. Really, you would be forced to choose between myself and the Africa continent, and in the eyes of your leaders, the governments are still supreme. So I won't try to convince you of which side to take. But if your plan is to try to get me to back down, then you're coming at this from the wrong angle. The reason you're so confident is because your scouting has told you that I'm relatively alone. True enough, but you're free to test my bottom line. Silas looked at them calmly. If that is all, you can leave now. Virgil gulped, feeling like he was walking on tenterhooks. He had realized already that he was dancing a line between life and death, but this was the first time he realized just how deep he was in it. This was no normal man. Virgil and Austin lowered their heads and made their way back with quick steps. Silas cast a glance over to Tassia before walking away himself. She seemed to be hesitating about something, but it wasn't Silas' problem to deal with. In the end, she took a step toward Silas. Silas, she started enthusiastically, but when Silas actually turned back toward her, she felt a shudder run through her. There was something particularly oppressive about Silas' gaze that made her feel it all the way down to her toes, almost like she had been thrown into an ice cellar. She had been trying to be just as cheery and casual as before, but it was hard to do so when Silas was bearing down on her. The best thing for her was to continue to be oblivious and take advantage of her charms to try and get closer to Silas. Didn't men like ditzy, clueless women? But it only took her a moment to realize that this sort of shtick wasn't enough to entice Silas. His analysis from earlier had made his meticulous mind obvious enough, but she had thought that if she randomly changed her personality in the middle of their first meeting, it would leave a bad impression. "What's wrong?" Silas asked coolly. Tassia took a breath, gazing toward Nosfaline, who was still by the door. "Can we speak somewhere more private? I have additional information for you." To her surprise, Silas nodded quite easily. "Sure." Silas walked into the City Lord's office. By now, the City Lord had already vacated the premises, taking up one of the vacant Duke houses ready for heroes of Earth to buy them up. The office was pretty spacious and grand. There were panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows in the circumference and a large desk in the center that looked large enough to be a dining room table for 12. There was a seating area to the side and even a small greenhouse by the side that had the function of multiplying the amount of ether in the air. The difference between this place and the outside was like night and day. Silas took a step forward, but he heard the door click behind him, and he felt two arms wrap around his waist, a pair of something soft squeezing onto his back. Looking down, he found a pair of small hands resting where they definitely shouldn't be. What surprised him wasn't the action. He had somewhat expected something like this. What he didn't expect was his reaction to it. Maybe he should have, though. Every time he had a great breakthrough, especially in genes, it was like his will to pass on those very genes multiplied several times over. After he gained his dual-class constitution, it only became worse. And from what he could see, it would only continue to do so. The heat in his lower belly almost flared out of control. Almost. He stood in silence, taking a breath and squashing the fiery heat. "Is this what you wanted to talk about?" Silas asked. Tassia bit her lip. She had already expected that something like this wouldn't work on a man like Silas. Even if she was 10 times as beautiful, it likely wouldn't make a difference. But she at least had to try. She gritted her teeth and chose to be a bit shameless. She removed her hand from Silas' crotch, not wanting to push her luck, but she didn't move very far away. "If I return now, the odds they will kill me are high. Those two are probably already dead. They don't want you to send someone to follow us back." Silas didn't respond. It would be a smart action. If he didn't already know the exact location of their villages thanks to the City Stella's ability. "Is this what you wanted to talk about?" Silas asked again, not changing his tone in the slightest. "No, I really do have information. It's just that, I can't return. I have no family, and they will lord my life over my head every step I take." Tassia thought that she could pull on Silas' heartstrings since he didn't push her away. In reality, the only reason he hadn't was because he was trying to make sure the heat in his blood had calmed down completely. The truth was that he was interested in Tassia for a completely different reason. Her performance this time was quite good. If she had a profession to match it, she could do some good things. Most importantly, he was looking for a steward that could replace Gregory for chaosheir. She had the right combination of meticulousness and boldness, a conclusion he had come to in just a few interactions. However, she was going to have to stop this habit. Silas finally calmed completely and took a step out of her arms, turning to face her. He looked her up and down to find that she was actually still surprisingly calm. Maybe it was because of the evolution of his will, but he could also feel that she had something else interesting inside of her. Is that the real reason I'm drawn to her? The greed seed. It could sense something it wanted. But by the same token, what it wanted to devour would also come from people who could be quite useful. "What is this information of yours?" Chapter 546, One Woman. Silas didn't press her because he could easily guess what she was thinking. To him, she didn't need to go so far. He had already been interested in taking her under his wing, though he had definitely planned to test more. That said, between her performance and the odd actions of the greed seed, he was already leaning toward being just fine with protecting her. He had no issues going the extra mile if someone was useful. He had saved the shieldman from his military duties and military supervision, he had practically kidnapped Morgan from the Celestial Republic, and he still hadn't forgotten about Archibald. Now that he and Lucius had had a falling out, he was very much interested in taking that man as well. Although Silas couldn't and likely would never start a city himself because of all the restrictions involved, he knew that he would definitely have to nurture a force of his own eventually. Of course, the obvious path was to rely on chaosheir. She had already done much of the legwork. he just had to put the right pieces around her. Unfortunately, many of those pieces had ended up getting scattered. Morgan was stranded in the Evergreen territory along with Sunniva. He still had to find a way back to Lone Star to retrieve the kid and Professor Fembroise, and the problem with Nosfaline was its own tricky endeavor. From Tassia's perspective, though, she had no idea what his plans were or what his thoughts of her were. Anything he said now would just make it seem like he wanted her to give him the information so he could kick her out. It seemed like she would have been much more at ease if he actually took her in the way she expected him to. You understand that even if I sleep with you, I could still abandon you. Silas eventually spoke, trying to get a full picture of what this woman was thinking. Tassia looked up at him, her eyes still full of hesitation, but her expression calm. I don't believe that. Silas' eyebrow raised. Why not? I can feel what type of person you are. Can you? It doesn't seem that way. If she had known what type of man he was, she wouldn't have tried to seduce him at all. You are very possessive. If I slept with you, you wouldn't allow me to be with anyone else. That would be a form of protection for me. Silas' gaze flickered. Was this true? Probably, but there's another way for me to make sure of that too. Tassia paled and looked away when Silas said these words. She had thought of it, but she didn't want to believe it. If she showed some use, surely Silas wouldn't kill her, which was also why she had come with information. There's something odd about this woman, Silas thought. She has no level, no class, no profession. So where is this intuition of hers coming from? And why is the greed seed interested? No. Silas realized that it wasn't just the greed seed. The gluttony seed seemed to have sensed a subtle destiny as well, so faint that it wasn't until he had truly begun to pay attention to his seeds that he felt anything at all. Then maybe. Silas tried to trigger a system contract. And as he expected, it worked. Tassia was taken off guard when she saw the screen. She had just been about to make one final push when this happened. She didn't even know that this was possible, and now that she did, she felt a bit embarrassed about her earlier display. System contract offered. Contract originator, less than Silas Grimblade greater than. Offer, working terms. Details. Tassia felt at ease after reading through things and immediately accepted. Of course, what she didn't know was that because her will and that of Silas were so far apart, Silas could terminate or break the agreement whenever he wanted. Maybe she would be smart enough to figure this out in the future, but in that case, she would also realize that since Silas was willing to do this, dance, with her, he was at least not interested in killing her just for the sake of doing so. Now whether or not he would continue to invest in her, that was a completely different matter. After relaxing, more of Tassia's real personality came out. Are you sure you don't want to sleep with me? The offer is still on the table, she said jokingly. Well, it seemed like half a joke. All things considered, if she was going to have to sell herself, Silas wasn't a bad option. She hadn't had such a misfortune during the summoning yet, but she wasn't a fool. There were probably women all over the world forced to do exactly this. The problem was only made worse by the fact men had been most likely to accept the trial, causing the population disparity and strength disparity between the two genders to take a turn for the worse. That said, that was only among the common people. I'm only interested in one woman. Silas replied, thinking through his next steps. Oh, Tassia blinked. Is it Nosfaline? She had done her due diligence and had at least learned Nosfaline's name. Her instinct was to call her that alien woman, and seeing her for the first time had certainly been a surprise she had to suppress. But she was also smart enough to know that calling Nosfaline that might offend either one of them, and she didn't want to undo all the progress she had made. No, Nosfaline is just my beast contract. Tassia's brows shot up, but Silas spoke before she could make any more flirtatious jabs. Now, should we get down to business? Ah, right, almost forgot. Tassia chuckled for a moment before she too became serious. Silas nodded inwardly. If she had no off switch, he might have to rethink this. You are right that the Africor continent is supporting us. What you might not know is that this isn't the only request that was made. Chapter 547, Tassia. Silas raised an eyebrow. Honestly, all this time, he was trying to figure out what Tassia might know. He didn't expect it to be something super important, but he also felt that it had to be something worthy of bringing to his attention. For Tassia to be sent here, it meant that she wasn't very valuable to the higher-ups of Gothamshire. They didn't care one way or another if she was killed, and as Tassia said, they would probably act to kill them on the way back so Silas couldn't track them. Silas honestly didn't expect any one of the envoys to even be aware of the Africor continent's involvement in the first place. So how did Tassia know not only this, but even more information than that? Tassia blinked, seeing through Silas' thoughts. It's very easy to get information out of men who feel the need to prove themselves everywhere they go, she said with a smile. It just made it harder on me that you weren't one of them. Is that so? Tassia's smile didn't waver. When you go to Gothamshire, you'll see that although it has its flaws, it's built on a system of rules. What you're thinking of isn't likely to happen. And what am I thinking of? It sounded like Silas was flirting with Tassia, but he truly wanted to understand her thought processes. It was honestly hard to tell if she was someone of great intellect, or if she just had high EQ, or if she had some combination of the two. I didn't have to spread my legs to get this information, Tassia said cheerily. Silas shook his head. This woman really always had sex on the brain. Jokes aside, I was a maid for much of my time in Gothamshire. I've overheard quite a number of things through thin walls and small serving windows. The city lord, Eames, also had a habit of writing down everything into notepads. He once said that he preferred voice notes, but he obviously can't use them in this situation. I see, Silas nodded. She explained it simply, but Silas knew that this bold woman had likely risked life and limb several times. And what is the request? An ether stone mine, Tassia said in hushed tones. She hardly knew anything about this world, she hadn't even leveled up before. But what she did know was the value of ether. When she matched that with what she knew about the value of unrenewable resources, it was a no-brainer just how important this information was. Silas' gaze flashed. Is it the ether stone mine I already know about? If that's the case, their ability to case a region and find valuable targets is greater than I gave them credit for. Somehow, they already figured out my location and the fact I have no faction backing me. That alone is enough to be wary. But this is an extra mile. It's more likely that this ether stone mine and the one I know of are one and the same. Otherwise, the government would have acted to secure it already. Silas knew even more about the value of ether stone mines than Tassia did, obviously. Right now, they were still in a bit of a lull period, but in the future, as technology began to catch up to the summoning and the humans of Earth recovered and advanced, ether stones would become the cornerstone of energy. Even now, they were shortcuts to leveling up and could produce a large number of experts in a short time. A single fragmented ether stone would probably be enough to take someone without a class or unique gene all the way to level 5 in a single bound. In fact, Silas was only speculating, but it might be even more exaggerated than that. This information is good, Silas nodded. Do you know anything else? Tassia's eyes lit up before she shook her head. She had already stuck her neck out to learn this much. If Silas was expecting more, she really didn't have it. That's fine. You're one of my people now. For the moment, I can't do much for you but make your life comfortable and relatively safe. As for what the next steps will be, it will depend on your background and experience. Before the summoning, what did you do? Tassia smiled bitterly. I was a student. I didn't get to do much of anything yet. I was working on getting an internship at Goldman's. Investment banking. Well, sort of. Tassia rubbed her nose. But not really. I wanted to become one of their lawyers. Silas would have given her a weird look if he had that expression in his repertoire. Becoming a corporate lawyer wasn't the odd part, but trying to get an internship as a corporate lawyer from an investment banking firm was, well, ridiculous. Those sorts of firms only hired the best of the best. They weren't going to take on a newbie lawyer. They also already had a law firm that they likely favored and had a many years-long relationship with. How was Tassia expecting to make it there? Don't look at me like that. I was close, okay. Where did you go to school? Silas asked. Tassia cleared her throat again. Legia's. Silas looked confused. He had never heard of this university before. That meant that Tassia was 2 orders off from her dream. First, an investment banking firm would never take on a rookie to fight for them. And second, the law firms that she would have to get hired by in order to even have a chance at Goldman's usually only hired from legacy, blue-chip universities. How was she expecting to make it? Looking at her appearance, Silas had a guess. Could she have been expecting to seduce someone again? Silas couldn't help but be speechless. This woman, she was a beauty, though a step or two below chaosheir. Of course, he was biased, but that was beside the point. What he was most concerned about was whether she was a one-trick pony and his senses had failed him this time. However, it wasn't long before Tassia gave him an unexpected surprise. Chapter 548, Psychological Biologies. What was that? Silas asked. He had already had Nosfaline help Tassia settle down. The two of them now shared the same home in the Duke district. Considering the size of the lot, it would have been more than enough for 20 people, let alone 2. What he didn't expect was that Nosfaline would come back on her own to speak with him. They had been here for almost a week already, but this was the first time she had done this without it being triggered by outside interference. Silas had already realized that she was avoiding him somewhat, but it wasn't out of subterfuge. She was scared of him. He was just fine with that. The more apprehensive she was around him, and the more respect she held in her heart, the less likely she would be to ever betray him. She's odd, Nosfaline said again, not quite knowing how to explain further. This time, Silas just waited for her to sort her thoughts. Eventually, she spoke again. As you probably know, my charm works subconsciously. I don't have to try to trigger it. Silas nodded. The first time he met Nosfaline, he had almost lost himself in her beauty, something he never did. He managed to snap out of it, but he was always cautious with guarding his mind around her now. If he wasn't cautious, he could end up slipping. That had become less of a possibility after the most recent evolution of his will, but he still had his guard up in a lot of ways. And yet, for some reason, it doesn't work on her. But that's not exactly right either. I can feel that if I was more active in my attempt to charm her, I could make her fall. But it would have to be a slow and gradual process. Her mind is oddly tough for someone without levels. She's potentially dangerous. Silas knew some of this already. The fact the system agreement process worked with her could only mean that her will had a more tangible form than most. But this was still a surprise. Even Silas couldn't fully resist Nosfaline at the start, so how had Tassia done it? And you know nothing about this. I have a guess, but... Go on. The odds are just too low. If she was a descendant of my Clipsians, it would make sense. But for her to look so human, her blood must have been considerably diluted, at least 4, maybe 5 generations removed. The only way for her to have such innate charm, then, would be for a mutation to trigger. I don't know much about Earth, but the odds one of my people would get away with copulating with one of your kind is next to 0. The child would almost certainly be killed. But for the child to not only survive, but then make it through several generations. Silas fell into silence. For some reason, Archibald flashed in his mind. Is it related? His mind worked in odd ways, sometimes connecting things that even he didn't grasp immediately. Maybe. A sudden thought came to him. Archibald spoke in a very old-timey way. It was the sort of thing Silas would only see in ancient literature, and it didn't make sense at all for someone of the modern era to speak like that. He had thought of all sorts of possibilities, all the way from Archibald being an alien in the facade of a human who had learned their language through the wrong means, up to thinking that maybe Archibald arrived from the past. Neither conclusion was ridiculous given the current state of the world. Aliens were everywhere now in disguise, and he had experienced time warps several times now. But Tassia's appearance and Nosfaline's speculations made him think of another possibility. The humans from the 6th summoning. Or rather, the 8th summoning as he now knew it as. Technically speaking, if they were still around in some shape or form, and they had managed to hide for so long, they would be the exact sort of place that Tassia's lineage could hide. But this was too much of a leap, even for Silas. Though he thought about it, he didn't have nearly enough proof or information. By now, it would also be far too difficult to get his hands on Archibald again. He didn't fear Lucius. The problem was that he had to find a way to get back to the Evergreen territory. Do you have any way to confirm your speculations? Silas asked. Technically, Silas could do it himself by using Extricate to check Tassia's body. But he was curious. If she really is a Clipsian descendant, well, she will have some problems. Nosfaline pointed to her head. She'll be mentally challenged, Silas asked. Not exactly. The reason my Clipsian race is so against copulating with your human race is in one part due to racism, but there's also a functional reason as well. As you've seen already, our Clipsian race has some very peculiar habits. Well, they are peculiar to you. I've observed how your race works now, and I've realized that my actions with Sunova were very off-putting to you. I apologize for that. I'll try not to do it in your presence again. Silas waved a hand. I have no issues or care about things like that so long as it's effective. Nosfaline let out a sigh of relief when she heard this before continuing. To make a complicated matter simple, the mating patterns of our two races are too different. Our Clipsian women have a period once a month where we pass an egg. We do not carry our children, we allow the ocean to do so. As such, we are free to have many male partners. By comparison, human women are more selective because they have to be. Getting pregnant once consumes their vitality for up to a year between gestation and recovery. The clash of these two psychological biologies causes problems. Chapter 549, Psychological Biologies 2. What do you mean? Silas asked. Well, Clipsian women have periods of heat. Our bodies encourage us once it's mature to seek out partners. We test our men one by one until we find a suitable match. Only if the male's seed triggers certain changes in our bodies will we allow them to fertilize our eggs. We then allow the ocean to carry our eggs to term. Human women have these periods of heat as well, but they are much more frequent, coming once a month, whereas ours might only come once a decade, if that. As a result, they're also much more subdued and subtle, while ours are much fiercer. It practically consumes our minds and there's nothing we can think about other than copulation. Silas listened to this seriously. He could already guess where this was going and what the problem here was likely to be. When these two biologies clash, well, if there's anything the human race is good at, it's adaptation. Their biology is very good at fusing with that of others, and they are the race that can copulate with the widest variety of other races. My Clipsian race cannot copulate with the Dogons. Even if there wasn't a hatred between us, our biologies wouldn't be able to produce a child 99 out of 100 times. But humans can copulate with both of our races, and the result is almost always the human biology becoming the foundation. This not only makes the offspring weaker than fully fledged Clipsians and Dogons, but it also leads to some undesirable mutations. The libido of female half-Clipsians is especially high, and those periods of intense heat, rather than coming once a decade or every few decades, come instead every month. Silas fell into silence. That would explain a lot of Tassia's habits. But, she's not a half-Clipsian, though. Yes, if she did have Clipsian blood, it would be very dilute, probably only a 16th of her blood. I'm not 100% sure, but that should make things easier on her. But the intensity of a full-fledged heat cycle is quite high. Even if it's diluted by that degree, dealing with it once a month would definitely not be ideal. It feels like you're leaving out a part of this story, Silas said after a while. Why would this be enough to cause problems? Sure, having a bunch of women in heat wasn't ideal, but it wasn't to the point of being the serious situation Nosfaline was making it out to be. The other part of the story is male Clipsians. If female Clipsians are less selective than humans, then male Clipsians are the vice versa of male humans as well. Although male Clipsians can still impregnate many Clipsian women at once, they have a hierarchy of sperm cells as well. They can perform what we call an alpha fertilization just once a decade. This process is rare and it also requires ultra-sensitivity. This is the one example where a female Clipsian won't expel her egg first, and instead allow it to be fertilized within her womb. Only then will she expel it into the ocean. Usually, a male Clipsian will be highly selective with the women they use their alpha genes on. But half-Clipsians were found to have a biology that triggered this without the consent of the males. This was found to be because half-Clipsians don't expel eggs like full Clipsian women do. Silas finally understood. Half-Clipsians were weaker than full Clipsians, and they entered their heat cycle once a month on top of that. One could imagine that if these women were loosed amongst the male population of Clipsians, they would snatch up a large number of alpha fertilizations in a very short time. Given the short turnaround of their heat cycles, and the fact the Clipsian race as a whole was quite open with sex, a strong population of half-Clipsians probably set the Clipsian race back decades, if not centuries. So many alpha fertilizations were wasted on weak offspring. For the Clipsians, who were already on the decline after failing the second summoning and were barely hanging on, this sort of loss was unacceptable. Silas could understand why they would take such drastic measures. But that then only left the question of how Tassia, if she truly was part Clipsian, had made it to this point. Where were her parents, her grandparents, her great-grandparents before them? She had said that she had no family, so she likely didn't know, or she had lied. And now Silas was suddenly very interested in finding out why. This woman, who only seemed to have sex on the mind, might be a key to unlocking yet another secret of Earth. The more information he had, the more likely he would be to turn this around. If we can confirm that she is part Clipsian, what would that do for us? Silas asked. She has an odd mutation to her unique gene. Usually, half Clipsians are much weaker than Clipsians, but if there's a mutation. Although she's quite weak now, there's a chance that we can make her something great. But it will depend on what you want from her. I think she has great potential to be the manager of a territory, a steward, a negotiator, Silas explained simply. Nosfaline nodded. She doesn't have the body of a Clipsian, so battle definitely wouldn't be her strong suit. But her charisma and will should scale well. If this is all you want from her, I can try to help. I can teach her how to use her abilities, but her profession. I cannot help with that. Leave that to me. I will find something, Silas said, looking off into the distance. In the Duke estate, Nosfaline and Tassia shared, there was the splash of water accompanied by the sound of slapping skin and muffled moans. Tassia gripped the side of the bathtub with a palm and forearm, her other hand moving up and down with such speed it practically blurred in the air. Her back was so arched that her clenched ass just barely touched the surface of the water as her eyes rolled into the back of her head. Her skin glistened with water and soap, her breasts jiggling around as her torso flexed, revealing a toned belly. Her fingers slid in and out of her slit, their ridges grinding into her clit as she unleashed a half-grunt, half-screech that made her earlier attempts to be quiet feel more like a joke. She collapsed into the water, letting it splash onto the polished marble. Fuck, he's so hot, she spoke between gasping breaths, rubbing her legs and rolling a breast in her now free hand. Images of Silas flashed in her head again and again, and before she knew it, her hand had slipped between her legs again. So strong, so masculine, his body, his smell, ugh. She didn't seem to consider the possibility of being caught, or maybe she didn't care in the slightest. Her fantasies carried her into the night, only becoming more degenerate as she wished for something thicker than her fingers. Chapter 550, Phoenix's Embrace. Silas dashed through the forest, moving with a smooth pace. By his side, there was the Basilisk King and the bone-tailed lizard, while Nosfaline trailed behind them. Given the weakening of his physical stats, though they still struggled a bit, they were capable of keeping up with him. Though, the bone-tailed lizard was somewhat amusingly clumsy. This could only be blamed on Silas, though. The lizard was still a baby, and though its state was exceptional given it was a level O, its coordination was lacking. Even Silas had to work diligently at using his body. Of course, a baby would have too. After his first week in this place, he had already managed to fully master up to less than Phoenix's Embrace greater than, the FFF plus grappling technique. So, he had decided that it was about time to start applying some pressure on his enemies. Plus, part of his strength was also his beast companions. Letting them come to train was an aspect of beast mastering that he had neglected too much. Most beast masters had to take the long and arduous path to help their beasts improve, going through constant battles and drilling skills again and again. Just because Silas didn't have to do that, thanks to his array of legendary path talents, didn't mean that he shouldn't try to use these methods from time to time. Still, as he moved, his thoughts were consumed by less than Phoenix's Embrace greater than. It was such a magical technique, one that enlightened him to the fact that grappling was far more special than he had given it credit for. The growl of a bear came from ahead. Silas pressed a foot down on a tree trunk, accelerating forward. He could tell with a glance that this beast was too powerful for the Basilisk King and the bone-tailed lizard, so he took the initiative himself. Andean Bear, F. Level, 22. Physical, 330. Mental, 217. Wool, 101. The bear was actually a very pale color from head to toe. It would have almost looked like a polar bear if not for the slight hints of brown and the fact it was much too small compared to that dangerous predator. Silas flashed before it, an illusory pair of wings appearing at his back. He stretched out a hand in a clawing motion, fast and deadly. The bear reached out to meet him, but there was a flash of red gold light before his hand appeared at its elbow. His body slid to the side as he clamped down on the arch of the bear's arm, pushing down. He seemed to have targeted a perfect weak point, collapsing the creature's arm toward the wrong direction. A roar of pain echoed, but Silas' grip on the arm only tightened as he circled to the bear's back and ripped its shoulder out of alignment. Silas slammed his back against the bear, now forced to its hind legs. With a flex of his torso, he shouldered through the creature over his head. Bang! The ground shuddered, plumes of dust and soil kicking up. The bear was belly up and completely disoriented, its head having slammed into the ground much too viciously. But Silas' movements were just as fluid, the illusory wings flapping once as his legs almost magically appeared around the bear's throat. The creature's muffled roars were stifled to silence as a sickening crunch echoed from a flex of Silas' quads. The bear's body convulsed and then stopped moving entirely. Silas stood, feeling that he was still missing something. He had reached legendary mastery in less than Phoenix's embrace greater than, and yet he still felt like he was just shy of true perfection. After reaching legendary mastery in so many skills, Silas understood the gap between them and progenitor mastery. Maybe you could never truly display the real might of a skill unless you made it your own. But there was something else as well, like a thin veil that obscured the truth of a skill just the slightest bit. Less than Phoenix's embraces seemed to be all about speed and leverage. It was a skill set that seemed combined with a movement technique. When activated, Silas' ability to maneuver around an opponent was unmatched. The advantage of having short burst speed in close quarters was invaluable. The bear couldn't even react to him despite having higher average physical than he did in his current state. This was where the illusory wings came from. But the skill consumed a great amount of ether. Even at legendary mastery, every burst was another ether unit down the drain. In that one short battle, he had used it 4 times. The consumption was far too much. But that was only one aspect of less than Phoenix's embrace greater than. The other was a subtle comprehension of the body of the opponent you were facing, allowing you to target weaknesses, snapping bones out of place, and flipping over opponents with much greater strength and weight behind them. Phoenix's embrace. Silas looked down at the beast beneath his feet and casually put it away. Then, he continued forward. Sometimes he would allow the Basilisk King to fight, sometimes he let the bone-tailed lizard have a go. The little guy was still trying to communicate with him with incoherent babble from time to time. Silas found it fascinating, but he hadn't managed to find anything else impressive about it. It seemed he would have to let the lizard out more often so that it could develop its language skills. The bone-tailed lizard rushed back to Silas after killing a beast, its tail swinging with flesh and blood. But it didn't seem to notice at all as it nudged its head against Silas' leg, looking for praise. Silas patted its head absent-mindedly. It should be close. I'll bring these guys back in for now. He had an entire territory to himself and a map of all the best resources in it. Of course, these didn't include the ones deep underground, but that didn't mean he didn't still have a shocking number to choose from. First, he would have to add to his team.